Bonsoir, étudiant de français. Ça va? Hey, notice that I used a couple of different expressions this time to greet you. So instead of saying bonjour, I decided to say bonsoir, and that's because it is evening. So that would be the right word to use to say hello to you. I also, this time, instead of saying comment allez-vous, the more formal way, I decided to say ça va. So this is the more informal way to say hi, how are you? So it depends on who you're talking to, if it's a more formal group of people or you're talking to your friends or your family members. Okay, so remember in the previous video, we talked about some ways to describe yourself, like moi, je suis professeur, moi, je ne suis pas étudiante. So some ways to say what I do and what I don't do. So I am a professor, I'm not a student. I could say le français est intéressant, so I could describe the French language, how I feel about it. So kind of learning to use adjectives to describe yourself and to describe other things like languages. We also looked at some verbs and how you can use those verbs to describe your activities, like working, speaking, where you live, etc. Okay, so moving into this last part of the lessons for this week, in addition to talking about yourself, talking about your activities, it's also important to be able to tell about the time, like when are you doing these different activities? And they're important parts of any conversation. So the first question we see up here is, quelle heure est-il? Okay, so notice that the word heure it has a silent H at the beginning, and that's going to be important for when we learn how to pronounce different ways of telling time. Okay, so basically the way to tell time in French is really almost identical to the way we do it in English. It's almost word for word the same. So in English, I would say it's 3 o'clock, or it is 3 o'clock. In French, I will say il est 3 heures. So it literally means it is 3 hours. So instead of o'clock, like we would say in English, they would say hours in French. Okay, so basically the formula here is you can substitute that number with any other number on the clock to be able to tell the time at the hour. So il est 1 heure, it's 1 o'clock. Il est 2 heures, it's 2 o'clock. Notice that the X at the end of the word de, normally it's silent, right? But when it gets connected to the word heure that begins with a silent H, it becomes a liaison, a link or a connection between those two words. So I now pronounce it il est 2 heures. Okay, and if we're talking about noon, the middle of the day, then I'm going to say il est midi. Now if I'm talking about the middle of the night, 12 o'clock, il est minuit. Nuit is the word for night. Mi just means half. So it's literally like saying it's the middle of the night. So the formula basically for putting together a sentence that tells about the time in French is pretty simple to master, I think. Okay, let's move on to another aspect of telling time in French. So, of course, I can say that it's 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. Il est 1 heure, il est 2 heures. But sometimes I'm going to need to include some minutes when I tell the time. So to tell time after the hour, up to the half hour, up to the 30-minute point, you're going to say something like il est 3 heures, and then I'm going to add the minutes. So il est 3 heures 5. I basically use the same sentence to say what time it is, and I just add the number of minutes to the end. So, il est 3 heures 5. Okay, I could say il est 3 heures 15, il est 3 heures 14, il est 3 heures 29. I can add any sort of number up to 30 to tell the time before the half hour. Okay, but for a quarter after, generally, people use the expression écart. So, il est 3 heures écart. That means that it's 3:15. Or if I want to say it's 3:30, it would be il est 3 heures et demie. Okay, so we use the word et to tell time in those two expressions. And with midi and minuit, use et demi without the final e, just a small detail. So it would be midi et demi, midi or minuit et demi without the final e. So some examples of other times here. Il est 1h10. So it's 1 o'clock and I just add the number 10 to the end. Il est 1h10. Okay, for 3:15, instead of saying il est 3h15, like 3 o'clock plus 15, you could say it that way, but very often people will say il est 3h15. And quart, you might notice, looks a whole lot like the word quarter in English. So it's basically a quarter hour. Lots of words and similar words we can recognize between the two languages. Okay, il est 9h30. Notice that there's a liaison between 9 and heure. So we don't say il est 9h, we say il est 9h. The F transforms to a V sound, and that's just because of that silent letter that comes after it. Then we can say il est midi et demi. So it's 12:30. Il est minuit et demi. It's midnight and 30 minutes. And notice that we don't have the E sound on the end of demi for those. All right. So instead of using AM and PM like we would do in English, in French we use kind of like expressions that go with the time of the day. So I could say il est 8h du matin. Remember the U sound that I taught you about a few videos ago, and I gave you a coffee shop challenge about it. And then remember also the nasal sound at the end of the word matin. There should be some sound waves traveling through your nose when you say that. Il est 8h du matin. No, it's 8 o'clock in the morning. Okay, I could say il est 1h de l'après-midi. So in this case, it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so up until 6 p.m. Or I could say il est 9h du soir. So it's 9 o'clock at night. Okay, so instead of AM and PM, we just add the time of the day basically to tell people what time it is. Okay, so this clock is kind of, I think, a helpful way to be able to visualize this, and it sort of like gives you a little bit of a formula to be able to put all of this together. So we already know that we can say il est 1h, il est 2h, il est 3h, and just add the number of minutes to the end of our sentence. Il est 1h05, il est 1h10, il est 1h15, il est 1h20, il est 1h25, il est 1h30. Okay, so all the way to the 30-minute mark, I'm just adding minutes to tell the time. Now, if I want to tell the time on the other side of the clock, I've got to do something a little bit different. So if I want to say, oh, sorry about that. That comes later. If I want to say that it is 12:55, for example, I would say il est 1h moins 5. Okay, so when the number of minutes is between 30 minutes and 59 minutes, instead of adding numbers to the time that you have, you're actually subtracting it from the next hour. So instead of saying il est 12h55, which would be 12:55, we would just say it's 1 o'clock minus 5, or it's 1 o'clock minus 10. So il est 1h moins 5. So it's literally, it is 1 o'clock minus 5. Il est 1h moins 10. So it's 12:50 in that case. It's 1 o'clock minus 10. Il est 1h moins le quart. So it's 1 o'clock minus 15 minutes. That would be 12:45. Or il est 2h moins 20. So that would be like 2 o'clock minus 20 minutes. That would be 1:40. Or il est 1h moins 25. So that would be like 12:35. So basically from The 12 all the way down to the 6 for the first 30 minutes of the hour, you add minutes to your sentence. Il est 3h05. It's 3:05. But when I want to express the minutes between the 30-minute point all the way back up to the 12, I'm going to subtract it. So if I want to say it's 3:45, I would say il est 4h, it's 4 o'clock, moins le quart, minus 15. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, and actually a couple of the exercises in MindTap should help you practice this. Okay, and finally, just to wrap this up a little bit, we can also use the word or the preposition à to ask or tell at what time something takes place. So a question here might be, le cours de français est à quelle heure? And notice I'm doing a liaison between the T at the end of et and a that comes after it because it's a vowel sound. So, le cours de français, the French course, est à quelle heure? So it's at what time? Basically, what time is the French class? Okay, so we can say, le cours de français commence à 1h. You can probably make a guess about the meaning of the word commence, right? Think about when you graduate from college. It's usually called a commencement ceremony, right? Have you ever wondered why it's called a commencement ceremony? It's basically the verb in French, commencer, means to begin. So your commencement ceremony when you graduate from college is a way of beginning your new life after being a student. So hopefully that will help you remember the meaning of this word in French. So, le cours de français commence à 1h. So the French course or the French class begins at 1 o'clock. Le cours de français finit à 2h15. I think you can guess the meaning of fini, right? It looks very similar to a word in English, which would be finish, right? So the French class finishes at 2:15. Le cours de français finit à 2h15. And notice we have the silent T also at the end of fini. Okay, so to say that you do something from a certain time to another, you can use these prepositions de and à. Le lundi, je suis en cours de 9h à 1h. So Monday, or basically all Mondays, it's like a habit. Le lundi, je suis en cours. I am in class. De 9h à 1h. From 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock. Okay, so that would be a good way if you were having a conversation with somebody and you're describing yourselves, who you are, where you're from, where you live. You might also say that you're a university student and what your schedule is. So I could say, je suis étudiante à l'université et le lundi, je suis en cours de 9h à 1h. So I'm a university student and on Mondays, I'm in class from 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock. So little by little, we can start to piece together some different ways to have conversations. Okay, so that's everything about telling time. And the next topic that we get into next week will be some useful classroom expressions. Even though we're not meeting in a physical classroom this semester, definitely if you continue with your studies of French in the future, those expressions will become more and more useful to you. So once again, I will say bonsoir, have a good night, and à bientôt. See you soon.